I can jump down from here.
A 6-year-old boy woke up this morning as fourth in line to the British throne. By lunch, his name had been struck from the official succession register without explanation, without ceremony, and without warning. What the palace just confirmed about Prince Louis has shattered every assumption about the Welsh family's future. The document that changed everything. The leak came from somewhere deep inside the palace's legal department, a place where secrets are supposed to die in locked filing cabinets and encrypted servers. But at 9:17 this morning, a 3-page memorandum marked strictly confidential appeared on the desk of a senior correspondent at the Times. The journalist, a woman who had covered royal affairs for 23 years, read the first paragraph 3 times before her hands began to shake. The document was clinical in its language, bureaucratic in its structure, but devastating in its content. It confirmed that Prince Louis Arthur Charles of Wales had been formally removed from the line of succession effective November 29, 2024. The removal had been processed through the Succession to the Crown Act, approved by the Privy Council and signed by King Charles himself. No public announcement had been planned. The palace had intended to bury this decision in administrative silence, allowing it to surface only when some future researcher combed through succession records decades from now. But now the secret was out. Within 30 minutes, every central newsroom in Britain had obtained copies. By 10 o'clock, palace switchboards were overwhelmed. At 10:42, Kensington Palace released a statement so brief it felt almost cruel. Recent health assessments have necessitated adjustments to Prince Louis's future role. The family requests privacy during this difficult time. 41 words that confirmed everything and explained nothing. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Social media erupted with speculation, concern, and conspiracy theories. American morning shows interrupted their regular programming. CNN brought in medical experts to speculate about conditions that might disqualify a child from succession. British commentators, more cautious but equally stunned, emphasized that nothing like this had happened in living memory. Children had died, yes. They had been passed over because of their gender before the succession laws changed in 2013. But a healthy-looking child, photographed just weeks ago at a royal engagement, was suddenly removed from succession? Unprecedented. Outside Kensington Palace, a small crowd began to gather despite the December cold. Many were older viewers, people who remembered watching William and Catherine's wedding, who had celebrated Louis's birth in 2018, who felt a strange personal investment in these royal children they had never met. The most chilling detail in the leaked document was a single line buried in the legal justification. Ongoing medical evaluation has determined constitutional incompatibility with future sovereign duties. Constitutional incompatibility. The phrase was deliberately vague, designed to avoid specificity while providing legal cover, but it raised more questions than it answered. What medical condition could disqualify a 6-year-old child? Was it physical, cognitive, progressive, or stable? And most troubling of all, why had no one outside the immediate family known anything was wrong? Princess Anne, reached for comment by her private office, declined to make any statement, but sources close to her revealed that she had been consulted months earlier about the constitutional implications and had provided characteristically blunt advice. Sentiment cannot override duty. If the child cannot serve, the line must be adjusted. For Anne, who had spent her entire life subordinating personal feeling to institutional necessity, the decision was painful but obvious. King Charles, informed of the leak during a morning briefing at Clarence House, reportedly closed his eyes for a long moment before speaking. "This will hurt him," he said quietly, referring not to Louis's current pain, but to the pain that would come later when the boy was old enough to understand what had been taken from him. Charles knew that burden intimately. He had spent decades as heir, trapped in a role he never fully wanted. But at least he had been given the choice to accept it. Louis was being denied even that. By noon, the palace had mobilized its crisis communications team. Statements were drafted, then discarded. Legal advisors debated whether more transparency would calm the storm or intensify it. Medical privacy laws complicate every decision. Louis was a minor. His health information was protected, but he was also fourth in line, or had been until this morning, and the public believed it had a right to understand why a potential future king had been removed from consideration. What could be so wrong with a 6-year-old boy that the Crown, an institution that had accommodated kings with severe disabilities, mental illness, and moral failings throughout its history, had decided he could never be allowed to rule? What Catherine discovered in September. It was early September, just after the children had returned to Lambrook School following the summer break. Louis, always the most exuberant of the 3 Wales children, had seemed slightly off. He was forgetting things. Simple instructions given in the morning would evaporate by afternoon. By mid-September, Louis had begun experiencing what the family initially called episodes. He would stop mid-activity, his expression going distant as if he had stepped out of his body for 10 or 15 seconds. When he returned, he would have no memory of the gap. To him, time had simply skipped forward. The pediatrician they consulted initially suggested stress as the cause. Royal children, even young ones, lived under pressures that could manifest in unusual ways. But Catherine knew stress. She had watched George navigate it, had helped Charlotte through moments of overwhelming attention. This was different. The neurological assessment took place at a private clinic in London, far from any facility that might leak royal medical information. Louis, bless him, had been cooperative and curious, asking questions about the scanning equipment, charming the technicians with the same natural charisma that had made him a public favorite since his first royal appearance. He had no idea he was being evaluated for something serious. To him, it was an adventure, a chance to see interesting machines and miss school for a day. The results came back on a gray Thursday afternoon in late September. William and Kate sat in a consultation room decorated with bland, soothing colors, while a neurologist explained with careful professionalism that their son had a rare form of epilepsy. Not the kind that caused dramatic seizures, something subtler. Louis's case carried complications. The neurologist pulled up brain scans, pointed to areas of abnormal activity, and explained that Louis's variant was associated with concerns about cognitive development. Early intervention could help. Medication might control the episodes. But there were no guarantees. And there was something else, something the doctor said carefully, watching their faces. In rare cases, this type of epilepsy could progress, affecting executive function, decision-making capacity, and emotional regulation. Catherine heard the words, processed their meaning, and felt something crack inside her chest. William sat perfectly still, his face a mask, but his hands gripped the arms of his chair with enough force that his knuckles went white. The neurologist continued speaking, outlining treatment options, follow-up schedules, and therapeutic interventions. But both parents had already moved past those details to the larger, more terrible question. What did this mean for Louis's future? Not just his health, but his role, his place in the line of succession, his destiny as a royal child born forth to the throne. They didn't discuss succession that day. The wound was too fresh. Instead, they focused on Louis, on keeping his life as normal as possible, on shielding him from the fear they both felt but couldn't afford to show. The medication began immediately. Monitoring protocols were established. Teachers at Lambrook were briefed with carefully vague explanations about a minor health condition requiring accommodation. But as October arrived and the episodes continued despite medication adjustments, the conversation they had been avoiding could no longer be delayed. It happened late one night at Adelaide Cottage, long after the children were asleep. William sat at the kitchen table with a folder of medical reports and legal documents. Catherine stood by the window, staring out at the dark garden, her arms wrapped around herself. "We need to consider what this means," William said quietly. He didn't specify what this referred to. Kate turned to face him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then she said the thing they had both been thinking. "He can't be king, not if this progresses." William nodded slowly. The consultations that followed were conducted in absolute secrecy. Constitutional lawyers were brought in under the pretense of reviewing general succession protocols. Princess Anne, when consulted, had been pragmatic to the point of coldness. "The Crown has accommodated many things," she said during a private meeting at Windsor, "but it cannot accommodate uncertainty at the highest level. If there is doubt about his capacity, the line must be adjusted. Waiting until he's older only makes the decision more painful." William had wanted to argue, to defend his son, to insist that Louis deserved a chance, but Anne's logic was unassailable. The monarchy could not afford a situation where a king ascended the throne only to be unable to fulfill his duties. The hardest part was knowing that they were making a decision that would define Louis's entire life, and he was too young to have any voice in it. Princess Kate, late one night after another difficult conversation with doctors, had whispered to William, "We're taking away something he doesn't even know he has yet. How do we ever explain that to him?" William had no answer because there was none. Only the terrible necessity of parents who loved their child but served an institution that demanded impossible choices. And so, through October and into November, the process moved forward as documents were prepared. The medical reality no one wanted to face. The condition Prince Louis faced was cruel in its unpredictability. Juvenile absence epilepsy, particularly the variant identified in his neurological assessments, functioned like a thief that stole moments without warning. One second, Louis would be present, engaged, laughing at something George said, or concentrating on a drawing. The next second, gone. Each episode lasted between 5 and 20 seconds. To an observer unfamiliar with the condition, it might appear to be daydreaming or distraction. But these weren't voluntary lapses. They were electrical misfires in the brain, brief storms of abnormal neural activity that interrupted consciousness itself. The medication helped, but only partially. Louis was prescribed ethosuximide, the standard first-line treatment for absence seizures. The dosage had been carefully calibrated to his age and weight. Yet, even with pharmaceutical intervention, breakthrough episodes continued. The neurologist explained this wasn't unusual, but the medication itself carried complications. Side effects included fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and mood changes. For a 6-year-old already struggling with an unpredictable neurological condition, these additional burdens made daily life even more challenging. Catherine noticed that Louis, usually energetic and quick to smile, had become quieter. He tired more easily. His enthusiasm, that natural spark that had always defined him, seemed dimmed. The cognitive concerns added another layer of complexity. While absence epilepsy itself didn't directly cause intellectual disability, the constant interruptions to consciousness affected learning and development. Imagine trying to build knowledge when your brain randomly disconnects dozens of times each day and information gets fragmented. Early assessments suggested Louis's cognitive development was already delayed. Not severe, not alarming in isolation, but measurable. His processing speed lagged behind age expectations. His working memory, the ability to hold and manipulate information temporarily, was tested below average. These weren't permanent deficits, the psychologist emphasized. With proper support, many children caught up, but they were warning signs, indicators that the epilepsy was affecting more than just isolated moments of consciousness. The truly devastating aspect emerged during a consultation in early November. A pediatric neurologist specializing in epilepsy, brought in for a second opinion, reviewed Louis's complete medical history and delivered an assessment that William and Catherine had been dreading. In approximately 30% of cases with this presentation, the condition evolved, not better but differently. As children aged, absence seizures sometimes transformed into more severe forms of epilepsy. Tonic-clonic seizures, drop attacks, and in rare but documented cases, progressive cognitive decline. "We can't predict Louis's trajectory with certainty," the neurologist said. "He may stabilize, he may improve. Many children do, but given the frequency of his episodes and the early cognitive markers, we have to consider the possibility of progression." She paused, choosing her following words carefully. "If you're asking me whether he could reliably fulfill high-pressure responsibilities requiring constant alertness, complex decision-making, and impeccable judgment, I cannot in good conscience say yes." That statement, more than any legal argument or constitutional precedent, sealed Louis's fate. because the role of monarch, even in a constitutional monarchy, demanded exactly those capacities. The sovereign had to review state papers, meet with ministers, represent the nation in moments of crisis, and make decisions that, while largely ceremonial, still carried symbolic and political weight. William had asked the question that haunted every subsequent discussion. What if he improves? What if the medication works better as he grows? What if this is temporary? The neurologist nodded, acknowledging the hope in his voice. Then we reassess. But constitutional law doesn't allow for uncertainty. You can't place someone in the line of succession with a contingent asterisk. Either he's fit for the role or he's not. And right now, with the information we have, the answer is not. The medical privacy considerations complicated everything. Louis's diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis were protected health information. The family could choose never to disclose the specifics, but removing him from succession required justification, as the palace couldn't simply strike his name without explanation. Yet providing too much detail would expose a child's private medical struggles to global scrutiny. The compromise, crafted by palace lawyers and medical advisors, was the phrase that appeared in the leaked document: William's impossible decision. The document arrived at William's desk on November 18th, bound in dark blue leather, with the royal crest embossed in gold. Inside were 43 pages of legal text, medical assessments, constitutional precedents, and a single signature line at the bottom of the final page. Above that line, in formal script, were words that no father should ever have to read about his own child. I hereby consent to the removal of Prince Louis Arthur Charles of Wales from the line of succession, effective upon signature and royal assent. William stared at that line for 3 hours. He was alone in his private office at Kensington Palace, the door locked, his phone silenced. Outside, palace staff moved through their routines, unaware that the future king was sitting motionless, pen in hand, unable to cross the threshold between what he wanted and what his role demanded. The path to this moment had been agonizing, but every avenue led back to the same conclusion. The Succession to the Crown Act allowed for removal in cases of incapacity, but it required clear, documented justification. Half measures weren't possible. Louis either remained fourth in line with all the expectations that entailed, or he was removed entirely. There was no middle ground, no provisional status, no way to protect him from future expectations while keeping the door symbolically open. King Charles, during a private father-son conversation at Clarence House, had shared his own perspective with a rawness William rarely saw from his father. "I have spent my entire life preparing for a role I sometimes wish I'd never inherited," Charles said quietly, "but I was never given a choice. Louis is being given something I never had: freedom." It was meant as comfort, but William heard the subtext. His father believed removal from succession might ultimately be a gift, not a punishment. Princess Anne's counsel had been harder-edged. She met with William in early November at Windsor, walking through the cold gardens as they discussed Louis's situation. Anne, who had raised children outside the direct line and watched them flourish away from suffocating expectation, was blunt. "You think you're taking something from him. You're not. You're preventing him from being destroyed by something he can never fulfill. I have watched this institution consume people. If Louis's condition makes him unsuitable, removing him now is an act of mercy." But William couldn't shake the feeling that he was betraying his son. Every royal child understood from the moment they gained awareness where they stood in relation to the throne. George knew he would be king. Charlotte knew she was second in line, a position of both privilege and backup responsibility. And Louis, the youngest, had always been fourth. That number defined his place in the family structure, shaped how others perceived him, and would have influenced every major decision in his life. Now, William was erasing that number, and with it, he was reshaping Louis's identity in ways the boy couldn't yet comprehend. Would Louis someday feel relief, freed from expectations he could never meet? Or would he think diminished, marked as insufficient, defined by what he couldn't be rather than what he was? Catherine's position had evolved through stages of grief. Initial denial gave way to anger, then to a desperate bargaining with medical reality, and finally to a broken acceptance. But she added one non-negotiable condition to the process. Louis cannot know why, not yet, maybe not ever. He's 6. He doesn't understand succession. He barely understands being royal. If we have to do this, we tell him it's an administrative adjustment. We don't tell him he was removed because something is wrong with him. That condition shaped how the family would navigate the aftermath. The Privy Council meeting where the removal was formally processed took place on November 27th. William was required to attend, though he said almost nothing throughout the proceedings. Constitutional lawyers presented the case. Medical summaries, carefully redacted to protect privacy, were reviewed. The Lord President confirmed that all legal requirements had been satisfied, and then, with ceremonial efficiency, the Council approved the removal. Louis's name was struck from the official succession register. Just like that, decades of assumed futures vanished into the administrative record. William signed the consent document that evening, alone in his office. His hand shook as he wrote his name. The pen felt impossibly heavy. When he finished, he set it down and sat in silence for a long time, feeling the weight of a choice that was both right and unbearable. He had done what the crown demanded, but he had also done something else. He had chosen duty over his son, and that choice, necessary as it might be, would stay with him forever. Later that night, he went to Adelaide Cottage and stood in the doorway of Louis's bedroom, watching his youngest child sleep. Louis looked peaceful, untroubled, dreaming whatever 6-year-olds dream. And William whispered words into the darkness, how they're protecting Louis from the truth. The morning after the Privy Council meeting, Louis woke to a day that looked exactly like every other day in his young life. Breakfast with his siblings, getting dressed for school. Catherine braided Charlotte's hair while William checked George's homework. The rhythms of family routine continued without disruption, without any indication that something fundamental had shifted. Louis's removal from the succession register was, in practical terms, invisible to him. He was 6. He didn't check official palace documents. He didn't follow constitutional news. His world consisted of school, friends, family, and the comfortable predictability of Adelaide Cottage. So when palace officials quietly updated succession records and briefed senior staff on the change, Louis remained blissfully unaware, but protecting that innocence required careful management from everyone around him. Lambrook School had to be briefed not on the succession change, which they did not need to know, but on Louis's medical needs. The conversation with his teachers was delicate. However, the school responded with professionalism and discretion. Louis's teachers were experienced with children who had various learning differences and medical needs. They adjusted their expectations, provided additional support when needed, and treated Louis no differently than any other student who required accommodations. To his classmates, he remained Louis, the boy who told funny stories and built elaborate structures during playtime. George and Charlotte, however, presented a more complex challenge. At 11 and 9 respectively, they were old enough to understand succession, to know that birth order mattered, and to notice when something changed in the family structure. The decision about how much to tell them consumed hours of discussion between William and Catherine. They settled on a partial truth. In November, after the Privy Council meeting, but before the information leaked publicly, William sat down with his older children in the living room at Adelaide Cottage. George, ever serious and already burdened with awareness of his own future, had asked the question William dreaded. Is Louis okay? And William, choosing honesty over false reassurance, had said, he will be, but he needs support, and part of that support means adjusting expectations. Charlotte, more intuitive than her brother in some ways, had simply asked, does Louis know? When William said no, she nodded slowly and said, good, he shouldn't have to worry about grown-up things yet. The instructions given to both children were clear. They were not to discuss Louis's situation with anyone outside the immediate family. Not with friends, not at school, not even with extended family members unless an adult gave permission. It was a heavy burden to place on children, asking them to keep secrets that could affect their brother's future. Managing Louis's daily experience required constant vigilance. Catherine in particular became hyper-aware of any situation that might expose him to questions he wasn't ready to answer. When royal documentary crews filmed at Kensington Palace, Louis was quietly kept away from specific discussions. When family gatherings occurred and relatives asked about the children's futures, conversations were carefully redirected before they reached uncomfortable territory. The most challenging aspect was anticipating the moment when Louis would become aware of his changed status. At 6, succession was abstract, but at 10, 12, 15? Eventually, he would understand enough to ask why Charlotte was discussed as second in line, but he was no longer mentioned. Why did George receive specific briefings, but he didn't? Why his role in the family seemed less defined than his siblings? Child psychologists consulted privately, recommended a gradual approach to truth-telling. As Louis matured and his cognitive development stabilized or progressed, his parents could begin introducing age-appropriate explanations. The story would evolve with him. First, a simple acknowledgement that everyone in the family had different roles. Later, more specific explanations about health considerations. Eventually, if necessary, the whole medical and constitutional reality. But there was also the possibility, slim but present, that Louis might never fully understand. If his condition progressed as the neurologists feared it might, his cognitive capacity could remain at a level where complex constitutional concepts stayed forever out of reach. In that scenario, his ignorance would be permanent and perhaps merciful. The question of how much Louis might intuit on his own also lingered. Children, even young ones, sense when something is different about them. They notice when adults speak in hushed tones and stop talking when they enter the room. They feel the weight of unspoken concerns even when they can't articulate them. Catherine watched for signs that Louis was picking up on the family's anxiety, ready to provide reassurance the moment he showed confusion or distress. So far, Louis remained cheerfully oblivious. His episodes continued, medication was adjusted, and he adapted to his condition with the resilience children often display in the face of challenges adults find overwhelming. He laughed with his siblings, complained about homework, and begged for more time playing in the garden. To him, life was normal, and William and Catherine were determined to keep it that way for as long as possible. But they also knew that childhood doesn't last forever, and someday, sooner than they wanted to imagine, Louis would ask questions they couldn't deflect. He would like to know why his life looked different from what he had been led to expect. And on that day, William and Catherine would have to find words adequate to explain that love sometimes requires taking away dreams before they become burdens too heavy to bear. The succession crisis no one saw coming. The immediate constitutional consequence of Louis's removal rippled outward with surprising force. Princess Charlotte, at 9 years old, was now third in line to the throne. Not fourth, not a comfortable distance from the ultimate responsibility, but third. One heartbeat away from being heir to the heir. And that proximity changed everything about her future in ways the palace was only beginning to calculate. Charlotte had always been aware of her position in the succession, but fourth place carried a particular psychological safety. She was necessary but not critical. She would receive royal training but not the crushing preparation given to direct heirs. She could imagine, perhaps, a life that balanced duty with personal freedom. Third place offered no such comfort. If anything happened to George before he had children of his own, Charlotte would become heir apparent. The weight of the crown would fall directly on her shoulders. William and Kate recognized this immediately, and it terrified them. They had watched William's own childhood be consumed by preparation for kingship. They had structured George's upbringing around the careful balance between normal childhood and royal duty. Now Charlotte, who had been given slightly more freedom, somewhat more room to simply be a child, would need accelerated preparation for a role no one had planned for her to occupy. The public reaction to Louis's removal, once the initial shock faded, split along predictable lines. Younger audiences, especially online, reacted with outrage. How could the monarchy, an institution already criticized as outdated, remove a 6-year-old child from succession because of a medical condition? The optics were devastating. It made the crown look cold, ableist, and unwilling to accommodate disability. Hashtags demanding more transparency about Louis's condition trended for days. Disability rights advocates issued statements questioning whether the removal violated modern principles of equality and accommodation. The palace found itself trapped between competing pressures. Medical privacy laws prevented detailed disclosure about Louis's specific condition. But without transparency, speculation ran wild. Some claimed Louis had a terminal illness. Others suggested severe intellectual disability. A few conspiracy theorists insisted nothing was medically wrong and the removal was actually about something else entirely, some scandal or secret the family was desperate to hide. International reactions added another dimension. American commentators, already skeptical of monarchy as a concept, seized on Louis's removal as evidence of the institution's fundamental cruelty. How could a family remove their own child from consideration for leadership based on medical testing conducted when he was barely old enough for school? CNN ran segments exploring whether any modern democracy should still have hereditary leadership, given that this was how succession decisions were made. European monarchies, watching closely, recognized the precedent being set. If Britain could remove a child from succession based on medical concerns, what prevented other royal families from doing the same? The decision opened the door to future manipulations, in which inconvenient heirs could be sidelined under the guise of health. King Charles, privately briefed on the growing backlash, made a decision that surprised his advisors. He would not publicly defend the removal, but he would not remain entirely silent. In a carefully crafted statement released on December 5th, 2 days after the leak, Charles wrote, "Every family faces difficult decisions regarding the well-being and future of their children. The Wales family has made such a decision with love, with medical guidance, and with the long-term interests of their son at heart. We ask for understanding and compassion during this private family matter." It wasn't much, but it was more than the palace had said in the initial statement. And crucially, it reframed the narrative from institutional cruelty to parental protection. Whether that reframing would stick remained uncertain, but it gave supporters of the decision a foothold from which to argue. Anne, characteristically, cared nothing for public opinion. During a private conversation with William, she made her position clear. The crown survives because it adapts. Sometimes adaptation requires sacrifice. Louis is being sacrificed to preserve the institution. That sounds harsh, but it's true, and in time he may thank you for it. William had wanted to argue, to insist that what happened to Louis wasn't sacrifice but protection. But Anne's words, brutal as they were, contained a truth he couldn't entirely deny. The deeper constitutional question lingered unresolved. What did Louis's removal say about the monarchy's capacity to accommodate human vulnerability? Throughout history, the crown had been occupied by individuals with significant limitations. George III's mental illness, Edward VII's scandalous personal life, George VI's debilitating stammer. Yet all had served, some quite effectively. Why was Louis's condition, manageable with modern medicine and support, deemed incompatible with future service? The answer, uncomfortable but honest, was that the monarchy in the 21st century operated under different pressures than in centuries past. Modern media scrutiny allowed no hiding of limitations. For Louis himself, the long-term implications remained unknowable. He might grow up relieved to have escaped the prison of royal duty. He might harbor resentment for a choice made without his input. He might never fully comprehend what was taken from him. But one thing was sure. His removal marked the first time the modern British monarchy had formally acknowledged that not every royal child, regardless of birth order or bloodline, was constitutionally fit to rule. And that acknowledgement, however painful, however controversial, represented a kind of brutal honesty the institution had rarely displayed. The crown was admitting that kingship required specific capacities, not just bloodline. That duty came with prerequisites, and that love, parental or institutional, sometimes meant protecting a child by taking away a burden he could never safely carry. As December continued and the initial firestorm of reaction began to settle into longer analysis and debate, one image remained fixed in the public imagination. A 6-year-old boy playing in a garden, unaware that adults had rewritten his future while he built castles from fallen leaves. Whether that ignorance was mercy or tragedy depended entirely on who was watching and what they believed the crown owed its youngest members. For William and Catherine, they had made a choice that would define their family forever, and now they had to live with it, watching Louis grow, hoping his condition stabilized, and preparing for the day when their youngest son would ask the question every parent dreads. Why am I different? And on that day, they would have to find words gentle enough to preserve his spirit and honest enough to honor the truth. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.